All right, one more try. We pull out three here. Ba-boom, what do we have? We have the S, E, C. All right, how can we do that? How about the Security Exchange Commission? Okay, our last little group that we're going to talk about, part of the New Deal, are alphabet agencies, are those agencies that focused on reform. They didn't focus on relief. We're not trying to get money in people's hands to immediately relieve suffering. They're not about trying to recover from the Great Depression. Instead, they are about trying to reform our system so that we never experience another Great Depression. All right, and there are organizations like the SEC, the Security Exchange Commission. This is going to set up a system wherein the stock market in banks are being watched over by a regulatory law enforcement government-run group to keep them from engaging in activities that would be that would endanger our economy. All right, remember that at least one of the causes of our depression was that the government or that the banking system failed, and they couldn't take the stress of the stock market falling and the cost of agricultural commodities dropping so badly, and so they couldn't take that shock. And so the SEC then monitors banks. Another organization that's going to come around, if you've been to a bank lately, you may notice that in the bottom corner there's a little stamp that says FDIC, or member FDIC. And you even hear it on radio commercials. If you hear a commercial for our local bank, they say member FDIC. At the end, what does that mean? It stands for Federal Depositors Insurance Corporation. Remember, again, trying to recreate trust in the banking system. That, remember at the beginning of the Great Depression, that when banks failed, or for that matter, if banks were robbed, you lost the money that was in that bank. It was gone. Well, now the FDIC comes in and says, no, we're going to insure your money. We're going to insure your money so that if that bank fails, it'll be replaced, or at least up to $300,000 of it, which I don't have that much money in the bank, so that's fine with me. All right, so it comes in, and they also do things they do stress tests on banks. They run scenarios with computers. They come in and say, okay, so if this happens, how will your bank respond? And to see whether or not your bank is strong enough to survive another shock like the Great Depression was. You'll know if you paid that much attention. We didn't lose a lot of banks during the Great Recession of the 2008, 2009, with the housing crisis and things like this. Banks didn't fail. I mean, and a lot of people have made comments about the President Bush saying, well, they're too big to fail. But the truth is, if those banks had failed, it could have tossed us into another Great Depression. And so they didn't fail, which was a good thing. So the SEC and the FDIC deserve a lot of credit for that. Other agencies that have come along is the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Agency. All right, it seems kind of strange, but we actually pay farmers not to plant food. Called soil banks. And the reason we do that, and we do agricultural subsidies, is so that our farmers can compete with farmers from overseas. For example, prior to the war or prior to the Great Depression, wheat farmers in America always had to price their wheat less than farmers, say, from Australia. And so that was constantly pushing the price of wheat down to this competition. And so what subsidies do is they come in and we kind of say, hey, listen, we're going to pay you a little bit of extra because you're growing something that we want. And, but we're not going to add any extra price to the price of wheat coming from Australia. So we're not damaging their economy while at the same time so much as we're helping our economy, which is good for us. And so the Agricultural Adjustment Agency, or AAA, is another, again, it's an attempt to change how our governmental system and how our economic system was functioning so that something like a Great Depression would never happen again. So, did it work? Well, we've never been through another Great Depression, so it's easy to say yes, they did. But at the same time, just because we haven't been through a Great Depression doesn't mean we won't ever go through a Great Depression. So I don't know. I can say for the last 100 years since the Great Depression, almost 100 years now, that our economy's had some ups, it's had some downs, but nothing quite as traumatic as the time period between 1929 and 1941. That time period, with all its dehumanizing suffering, was horrible, and it was a global experience. We in our country, we got FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, with his New Deal, with his focus on relief, his focus on recovery, his focus on reform. Other countries, not as lucky. For example, in Germany was also going through this Great Depression. We spread ours through the Tariff Act and through the failure of the bank system. And they didn't get an FDR, they got an Adolf Hitler. They elected Hitler in their attempt to get out of their Great Depression. And they got out of that depression and right into World War II as a result of that. But in the United States, we took a different approach. And so I want to talk, so in class, we'll look at what was going on. We'll talk about some of the things that were going on by looking at the pictures from the time period. But to me, I guess since this is the third of the three videos, probably the biggest takeaway is that those agencies, so many of those agencies have gone away. But almost all those recovery agencies have gone away, for example. But many of the reform agencies are still with us. There's still an SEC, and they're still monitoring banks to make sure they don't break the banking rules. There's still an FDIC protecting my savings account and yours if you happen to have one. Other organizations that came around during this time are still in existence too. The reform, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, is still enforced. And so in terms of the relief, recovery, and reform, the reform agencies have been the longest lived, which, if you think about it, makes sense. We don't need the relief that we needed during the Great Depression. And since we're not in a Great Depression, we don't need to recover from one. So we don't need those organizations in the same way that we need the reform organizations. And then once you reform something, you got to make sure it stays reformed. And so we continue to keep those organizations around. All right, until then, I will see you in class, and I hope you have a great day.